So the topic today is slavery in the United States, the history of slavery in the United States. So, as all of you might know, that this is a very fundamental topic in the history of US optional subject. It is a topic which I believe a lot of people just cover very superficially. You know, they have just an idea that there was a slavery. People were sort of locked in, and they were made to do work, and then that's it. And then there was one day they were freed, and there was a civil rights movement. And it's people have just a very sort of they don't have a deep understanding of the slavery issue. So what I want to do today is get talk about slavery, the way I understand it, the history of it, its roots, its economic implications, why it started, why it persisted for so long, and how it was stopped, and what was the opposition for its stopping, and what were the reasons, economic or otherwise, and why the integration of African Americans into the United States society took so long, and it in many ways it's still a unfinished business. Until recently we had this Black Lives Matter. So it's a sort of a complicated and nuanced topic that I want to try to do justice to. And before I get into the topic, I would like to say one thing at the outset, is that whenever you're preparing any topic on history, or I think there are many views out there. People have their own sort of well-established rhetoric or well-established answers that are out there. But I think the best approach that I've found as a history student is to start from scratch, and start asking questions, and then look for its answers. For example, so you try to build your own narrative rather than copy pasting someone else's narrative, or taking one person or one group's or one particular thought, theory, and just blindly accepting it. So what I did was, the way I built my knowledge or my thesis on slavery was to ask basic questions like this. Where did the slavery start? Why did it start? How were the slaves brought in? From where were the slaves brought in? And why were they brought in? How could what were the how could someone keep people against their will for so long and get productive work out of them? And was it just the Americans who had slaves, or there were other societies who had it? And then trying to think about economic implications, and then once African Americans were into slavery, what were the reasons or the forces that got them out of the slavery? And was it easy journey or not? And how do once a slave person get their standing in the society back and become as independent as they can, and how difficult that journey could be? So these are the questions that you can ask yourself, and and you look for and you look for those answers. So I tried to do exactly that, and let me share my screen, and then what I'll do is I'll sort of share my journey into it. So I will share my slides. So there are a bit of, when I was preparing for this webinar, although I knew this slavery as a topic to some extent, but when you have to, when you write down things, and when you have to commit to dates, sort of, for example, what something happened, but if somebody asks you what year did it happen, that's where it becomes really challenging. You really don't really know a topic until you sort of start writing it. So I prepared a presentation, and also I have some notes in Google Sheet. So I will share those things. So let's start from something that I always do, is that what's the sort of significance of this topic to the CSS exam. So one way to start is to you start looking at the past exams and see how often a particular topic has appeared. So we have a list of most repeated questions in our app, CSS Exam Companion. So from there, I'm taking this, so the number one popular topic is civil war. And as you will see in this presentation is that, civil war, one of the primary causes of civil war was the issue of slavery, and this sort of pit south of America and against north, and that's the civil war is very, very fundamental. So the most repeated topic in the CSS exam is related to slavery directly. Then there's a Constitution Revolution, Andrew Jackson, FDR, Harry S. Truman. And the seventh most important question is slavery. As you can see, the question on slavery appeared frequently until 2010. And there was a long period of 12 years where there was no particular question on slavery. Until this year, 2023, there was a question about slavery. And if you recall, the question was about the Middle Passage and the Northwest Passage. And the Middle Passage, as we'll see, is actually a route through which slaves were brought in from Africa to North America, and of course, other parts of Americas as well. So these are the two, out of the top 7 most repeating topics, slavery appears twice. So, and then these are the other topics which are not, we are not concerned with those topics in this presentation. So this is, let me just, I hope you guys can see this. So the number one thing is this sort of, this is the Middle Passage. This is the Middle Passage, and now what is the Middle Passage? Sort of this picture explains, demonstrates how slaves were brought into North America from Africa. So the way the trade was happening, this is a map of 1750s, how the trade was happening. I mean, slavery was happening before that as well and after that as well, but this particular snapshot pertains to 1750. So about 1.5 decades before proclamation of independence in 1776. So what is going on here is that, you can see a lot of arrows. So let me try to read a few things. What happens is that, these West Indies, Caribbean countries where British and the French, we had British and French colonies, right? They had a lot of raw material like sugar, primarily sugar and tobacco and fish and so on and so forth. And also these North American colonies. In the beginning, we had a few colonies, and by the 1750, we had 13 colonies. Virginia, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Massachusetts. These are, Boston is obviously not a colony. It's it's a city of Massachusetts. So these colonies, their economy at that time was agriculture primarily. Mostly agriculture. About 80-90% of the workforce was employed in agriculture at that time. And the most important crops were tobacco, cotton, and there were like a few other crops like corn and wheat. But primarily the most important 2 crops were tobacco and cotton. At that time, 1750, it was mostly tobacco. Cotton became important after that. But other than agriculture, there was one more important sort of commodity, which was fur. So as you can see, this arrow going from 13 colonies to Great Britain, these Great Britain, the ships would take these raw materials, tobacco, indigo, flour, lumber is wood. They will take these raw materials from 13 colonies into Britain, right? And Britain would use those tobaccos and all these raw materials and send those to all over Europe and other, and all over, so Britain will actually export all these things. And the way colonization worked was that, British would take the raw material and then sell it or add value to it and sell it around the world. And then, and British would make, sort of, finished products, like in this case, rum, manufactured goods, and send those gift products to Africa. And, and sort of these ships are starting from, from 13 colonies, and the ships go to Great Britain full of raw material, and then Great Britain convert those raw material into finished products. And then these ships take finished product to go to Africa, sell some of those finished products in exchange for slaves. There was a whole sort of economy in Africa where there were slave catchers. They were like, the kings of Africa, and the whole economy was going on where people would catch slaves and brought them to the shores of Africa, and then these slaves would be transported onto the ships and brought on the cargo ships to the Americas, and some of those slaves would go to West Indies, and some of those will go to Brazil, and some of those will go to South America, but some of those will also go to the 13 colonies. So this is what the whole trade is going on. So ships start from 13 colonies, go to British to Africa, and Africa to 13 colonies. So this sort of triangle is what is called Middle Passage. So this was the first question in 2023 exam, and it was also talking about the Northwest Passage. So it's not related to slavery, but I'll tell you, Northwest Passage is actually a passage on top of, like this, on top of Canada, and one, you can look into that separately. So that's Middle Passage for you. Now let's talk about, if we are talking about slaves being transported out of Africa into other parts of Americas. So what does the journey look like? So historians are very clear on, there's overwhelming evidence on the design of these typical ships. So this is what the sort of a design of a typical slave ship looks like. You have slaves crowded onto this ship. They would try to fit in as many slaves as possible, and they would be in most of those ships. Historians say that the slaves were sort of fastened. Their hands were tied, legs were tied, and they were put on the ships in the lying position. There wasn't enough space for them to sit or even stand in most of the cases. This is a sketch of a slave ship. As you can see, it's crowded. They would try to fit in as many slaves as possible into one ship. So let's go to the next this is another sketch. So be very clear that this is a sketch that someone has drawn. This is not a picture of an actual slave ship, sort of a rendering of it. So you can see at the bottom of this is a sort of a cross section of a ship. At the bottom of the ship, we have goods that has been transported. You can see ivory, there are barrels, there are some material. And on the top layer, there are slaves lying around. And as you can see, slaves are lying around or sitting around, but there is not enough space for them to stand up or to sit down. And you can see most of their hands are tied. They're not wearing anything except maybe barely enough to cover their private parts. In some cases, in some pictures, you don't even see that. So that's how the slaves were transported. The conditions were very, very bad on these ships. And historians say that 15 to 20% of the slaves would die during the journey. During the ship, there was no separate washrooms or anything. They had to use washroom, defecate themselves, right then and there, So imagine the conditions on the ships, And some historians have recorded that, some slaves would try to, the journey was so difficult that slaves would prefer to break free and jump into the ocean and try to sort of kill themselves rather than bear with this gruesome journey. So keep that in mind, this imagery, So let's go to the next slide. There's one thing that we forget is that, we sort of focus too much on the slavery in the North America, in the United States, but we don't really pay attention to what other parts of the world were taking in slaves. If you study the history of 18th century, 17th century, and part of 19th century, you'll see most of the major powers were involved into the slave trade, and it was a very lucrative trade. Um, you know, Primarily British Empire was involved in it. Interestingly, I found this statistics very, very interesting, is that only 3 to 4% of the slaves that originated from Africa would end up into what is now United States. Only 4%. That's a remarkable statistics. 96% of the slaves did not even go to US. They were headed towards other places. If you see this list, this is a percentage of distribution of slaves where they were taken. If you see, most of these slaves were going to either Caribbean or Brazil. As you can see, the first row talks about the mainland North America, and then Leeward Island, and 11% ended into Jamaica, Barbados. Most of the West Indies team that you see, these Caribbean islands, they are actually descendants of all these slaves that were brought into those Caribbean colonies. They were like sugar making colonies and all that. Barbados and Bahama, Brazil, and about 30-40% of the slaves ended up into Brazil. So don't forget that. Just keep that thing in mind, the whole context of what was going on. And one must ask, why is it that so much of the world at that time was involved into slavery? There was some kind of slavery in India and subcontinent as well. That was primarily, I didn't study much about that, but what I know is that primarily there were two kinds of slavery happening in South, in the subcontinent as well. Is that in India there was a trend to enslave untouchables. The lowest Hindu caste was enslaved by other people, probably, I'm not sure, probably by upper classes, but also the British would take indentured servants from subcontinent and send them to Africa and other countries. And that indenture was, what is an indenture? One can ask. Indenture is actually, you sign an agreement with someone that I will be your servant for X number of years, and then after these X number of years pass, I will get my freedom, right? So people would often sign those indentures, even in poor people who could not afford the journey from Europe to United States would sign those indentures in return for the journey. So investors, ship companies would sign those indentures. Okay, we'll bear the expenses of the journey, but you have to sell your X number of years to us. We'll use your labor free of cost, and after that time passes, then we'll free you. So indenture was happening as well, right? Now, one important question that one can ask is that why is it that much of the world was involved in slavery? The answer is very simple. It's because slavery was the cheapest form of labor. As you know, I don't know how many of you know this, but there was this philosophy around that time, 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, the philosophy of mercantilism. Mercantilism, the philosophy was, the more a country exports their products, the more foreign exchange, or in that time, foreign exchange primarily meant gold and silver and jewelry. That country will get in return, and the richer it will become, right? So British and other colonists, they were trying to maximize profits because of these new trades. One, we should keep that in mind, that tobacco was discovered in North America by the Christopher Columbus and all these people. Before that, tobacco was cigarette smoking, hookah, whatever, was unknown to Asia and Europe, and to the old world. So this was a discovery from the so these new products like maize, potato, tomato, they were discovered from North America. The old world didn't. So these were new economies that tobacco was very addictive, and people who were exporting tobacco were making a lot of money. These were new markets, new ways of making sugar were created in those times. So new products were created. Cotton was a new product, obviously after tobacco, but first tobacco, indigo, fur, sugar. These were major products, and British and other colonizers who were controlling these highly addictive products, they were making enormous profits. So these were so slavery is fundamentally about profits. It was, and it entirely, in my opinion, is about economy. It's about getting rich as quickly as possible, not only for countries but also for individuals, for like for businessmen, for merchants, for farmers. It was a way to become rich quickly. You didn't have to pay any kind of salary to slaves. You could and once it's benefiting you economically, you then justify it by any means. You try to mold your religion to it. You preach in your churches about slavery. You sort of uh, justify it any way you can because it serves your purpose. And then there was like theories brought forward by many common people, but also by many philosophers and thinkers, and by many founding fathers of America as well. That the theories went like African Americans, they were inherently inferior. They were like they were not like white man. They were inferior. Their thinking was inferior, and so on and so forth. These kind of sort of bogus theories that were thrown around, and many people genuinely believed in those things at that time. Right. Let's go to the next slide. Uh, this is a very interesting slide. I just told you that about only 4% of the slaves that originated from Africa ended up into United States. The rest of the 96% went into Caribbean, Brazil, and other countries of Americas. Right. Now the question is, what are the number of slaves? What's the numbers look like? This is how the numbers look like. And I have the data after 1790 onwards. 1790 is obviously right after Declaration of Independence, and right after the Constitution has been adopted in 1987, and 1790 is where the year when George Washington started as the president of United States. As the first president. So sort of the start of the presidency, we have the data from there. At that time, there were about 1 million total African Americans in the United States, and almost all of them were slaves. The black line is slaves. The gray line is free African Americans, and the blue line is total number of African Americans in America. As you can see, there were quite a few free people, but predominantly you see about, I think, 70, 80, 90% of the African American in the United States, they continued to be slaves till 1860, So you see that, this line, despite this is a graph of 70 years, and we see that, slavery continued to flourish. You see the black line, right? So during this time, although in 1808, importation of African Americans into America was banned by constitution. So in 1808, no new black African Americans were brought into America as slave people, right? So how is this growth happening? This growth is primarily happening organically by new births, and we'll get into like sort of why there's so much growth into it. There are different horrible things that are linked to it, but let's move forward. Now, this that keep that graph in mind, and then this graph actually, from this is a graph from 1810 to 2000. This is a graph of the labor force in different sectors of economy. As you can see, in 1810, the agriculture line is the sort of a red or purple line. In 1810, about 85% of the labor force were employed in agriculture. So even as late as 1810, agriculture is a primary sort of sector in the US. It's a primary source of labor or employment, right? So 90% are employed in agriculture. It goes down steeply from there till 1860, when we have about 55% of people employed in agriculture, and then till 1880, 90, then there's a speedy decline, and now in 2000 there's about 2% of the American labor force that is employed in agriculture. So from 1810 to 2000, we come from 85% to 2%. So this is a remarkable evolution of the labor force. This is happening primarily because of the technological advancement of machinery, tractors, other tools for agriculture, and economies of scale, and so less and less labor was needed. So back then, when slavery was happening, agricultural labor was very, very important for the economy, right? So one can say that America used the slave labor. As you can see in the last slide, I'll go back to the last slide if I can. About in 1860, there were like 4 million, 40 lakh African Americans who were doing labor in the United States, and primarily in the agriculture. So America used that free labor, exploitative labor of slaves to become an empire. One can say that the labor of slaves contributed directly to America becoming extremely rich and becoming a large empire. It's only when technologically less labor was needed, and when it was too late, that's when they sort of freed the slaves, and that happened in 1865 in the 13th Amendment, when Abraham Lincoln, at the end of the Civil War, banned slavery in America, and all the slaves were freed. And mind you, they were freed, but they could not win their equal status, right? So there's like very nuances to it. Just because Constitution has banned slavery doesn't mean all of a sudden their conditions have improved. So one needs to sort of pay close attention to what is actually happening, right? So let's go to, this is the same as a percentage. The same graph is in sort of a table form. In the agriculture, we have 2% of the labor force in 2000, as opposed to 84% in 1810. And now I'll talk about a few things. Let me just take a break from the PowerPoint. Let me go to my Google sheet that I've created. I have a slavery timeline, which I have in the Google Sheets. There's so many things to cover, but I will just quickly, touch upon a few things. So just to recap a few things, in 1619, that's about, keep in mind that the first colony of Jamestown in Virginia was started in 1607. slave. So in 1619, African Americans came as dentured servants. I explained what denture is. It's not like slavery. It's like a short-term sort of servitude. You're not slaves were slave, your property for life. But denture servants, there was a contract of a few years only. In 1640, somehow slavery started. They saw this opportunity that these African Americans, we can sort of keep them slave and all that. So 1640 is when slavery started. In 1660 to 61 is where the word slave started appearing in Virginia's law. Virginia was a state under British Empire. It was an independent state. It had its own governor appointed by British Empire. So it had the Virginia House of Burgesses, you call it. Forgive my pronunciation. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Virginia's House of Burgesses is called their sort of their Congress or whatever their sort of assembly. So they started using the word slave. The first time it appeared is in the 1660s. So I'm just sort of tracing the evolution of this, and there's a couple of things before. There's one important sort of judiciary case that happened in Virginia before a declaration of independence. So it's a famous case of Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key was a daughter of an African American woman, but a white father. So a white father, she had a white father and African American mother. On that basis, she petitioned to the court that, see, my father was a free man. I'm a daughter of a free man. I should be free as well. And the court granted her status of free woman, right? So, but after that, there was a hue and cry in Virginia. As a response of this case, what Virginian lawmakers did, that they made a significant change in the law. What they passed a law whereby they declared that a person's status of whether the person is free or slave would be determined by the status of the mother. So what this law allowed was that even people born out of a white father, their status would be white father and slave mother, their status would be slavery as well. So this law is sort of this horrible law. Otherwise, obviously there's no such precedence in the British law at that time. Common law, the people take their fathers sort of used to take their fathers sort of status and all that, but there they found a very interesting sort of way out to keep people into slavery. So even if a white man had raped or had a sort of illicit relationship with the slave woman, which was by that at that time very rampant. It was happening quite a lot. Slave women went through sexual violence, rapes, and all kind of sort of relationships. And what this law allowed was all the children born out of these relationships were continued to be slaves. And some historians say that due to this law, people would actually encourage slave women to sort of have as many children as possible, because they will grow up to be slaves, and slaves were very valuable when the importation of slaves were forbidden, and the slaves would be sold. People could sell their slaves for a huge profit. So now fast forward to sort of let's talk about founding fathers. What are the famous founding fathers of United States? Of course, the people who were involved into writing the Declaration of Independence and writing the law, Constitution, or the first few presidents are important. For example, George Washington was the first president. John Adams was the second president. Thomas Jefferson was the third president. There's someone, Benjamin Franklin, who was never a president, but he's considered a founding father. You have Benjamin Franklin's picture on the $100 note as well. So all these founding fathers, there were like 55 people who were involved into what is called Constitution Convention or the Philadelphia Convention, who were involved into writing the Constitution. And the Constitution, and it happened in 1787. There were 55 delegates. And, I wrote it somewhere here. 25 out of these 55 delegates, a significant proportion of that, 25 out of 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, they owned slaves, including the first president, George Washington. He had 600 slaves, and these slaves, he only freed these slaves on his death, sort of, at the very end of their life. So imagine, and then Thomas Jefferson, who's a very, very important president under whose sort of presidency they purchased Louisiana and all that. He owned about 300 slaves as well on his plantation. He had like 5,000 acres of land, and 300 slaves used to, plant that. So these founding fathers, they directly benefited from slavery, right? But, the same Thomas Jefferson, who would say all in the Constitution that all men are created equal, would own those slaves, and such was the hypocrisy at that time. But interestingly, the founding fathers were sort of visionary enough or smart enough to not use the word slave in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution the word slave has appeared. So just keep those things in mind. And a couple of other things that I would. What are some of the few founding fathers who did not own slaves, who was also opposed to slavery? Include Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, and a few others, primarily from New York, Massachusetts, and from the North, where, So, these are like the dynamics. The founding father, they were like, a lot of those were owning slaves, and primarily most of those were from, from the South, right? And so that's like the background. In 1793, into the presidency of George Washington, the Congress, the Federal Congress, created a Fugitive Slave Act, whereby it was, the act said that, any slave that has run away from their masters should be caught and sent back to slavery. So this is the sort of the background to slavery, right? Right. So there are like, I would sort of, I think I've gone into much more detail. The topic is so big that probably I'm not thinking that I might not be able to finish it in an hour or so, but let me just quickly go through a few books that were very, very important and fundamental to the, to the discussion of slavery and its abolition. So there was a 1839 book which was very, very important into bringing to the fore the realities of slavery. The book is American Slavery as It Is, a testimony of 1,000 witnesses. This book contains graphic details of what slavery is like, the horrible conditions, the whipping, the sexual and physical violence. The book is by three famous abolitionists, Angelina Grimke, Sarah Grimke, and Theodore Weld. Theodore Weld was a very popular abolitionist who married, I think, Angelina Grimke, and Sarah Grimke and Regina Grimke are two sisters. They were very popular, very active white abolitionists from the North, right? This book came out in 1839, and this in America there's a big culture of reading books. It's not like in Pakistan where books come up and nobody knows what's going on in there. The important books, they are read by a lot of people in America, right? There is a 1845 book by an African American, by a former slave, Frederick Douglass. He became very popular. Some say he became one of the most popular figures of 19th century. He was an orator, he was a speaker, he was not only well known in the US, but also in the Europe because of this book and his oratory and his leadership. The book is narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass by Frederick Douglass himself. It's the autobiography of his days of his slavery. So keep that in mind. These books were coming out, people were reading it, and primarily people in the South, people in the North who were deeply affected by these books, and they were becoming anti-slavery activists or spokesperson, and they were agitating and they were doing the activism to bring the end to slavery. But of course, South, who was benefiting from it, there was a culture of slavery. Their opinions were of course different. They wanted to continue slavery as long as possible. This 1852 book, keep that in mind. This book, 1852, is very close to the election of very close to the Civil War, about a decade before Civil War. This book was hugely popular, and it had a huge impact. The book is called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. In this novel, she talked about an Uncle Tom who would help slaves get free, so people just like this book gave people a lot of idea that anybody can help slaves. We should all help slaves get out of slavery, and a lot of people did that. We'll talk about Underground Railroad in a while. These books were having immense impact on the popular discourse. So please note that I'm not saying that you should read those books. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying these books, you should know that these books came out in that time, and these were important books, and you should know what these books are all about. I will share those notes, this presentation, and you can see I have written some brief, what is these books about. Sometimes I've copy pasted from other sources, which has really summarized these books really well. And then in the 1903, I am now at 1903, obviously it's fast forward after the Civil War. W.E.B. Du Bois was also a very influential, famous African-American leader. His book, The Souls of Black Folk, has its importance as well. I'll quickly talk about important Supreme Court cases. There was an 1857 case, Dred Scott versus Stanford. This is probably the worst. It's called the worst case in the Supreme Court history of the United States. It's a horrible verdict of this case.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. Can I audible, sir? I want to just, sir, ask something here. If it is convenient for you to answer me.
Yeah, yeah. Now that you've started.
There is a thing. In 2002 or 23 in the paper of United States of History in Pakistan, examiner sir specifically give with the like a northwest passage. So how an aspirant must write this term northwest passage with some kind of illustration of map or with some kind of expository illustration with the historical parameters. So what's your response on this thing, sir? I just want to ask that about.
Thank you. There will be a question answer session after, I'll open the floor in about 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes. There will be a question answer session. We will respond to that. But yes, the short answer is draw as many diagrams as you can. As many diagrams as you can in your paper. And this is not just I am saying it. most of the people who have topped or have qualified for CSS, they have recommended this. They've drawn so many diagrams. So draw as many diagrams as possible. I think you cannot demonstrate this Northwest Passage or Middle Passage without proper diagrams, right? I'm a huge fan of those. Anyways, coming back to Dred Scott versus Stanford, in this case, Supreme Court said that Dred Scott was an African American, was a slave, and Stanford was one of their honors. The case in this case verdict, Supreme Court said, African Americans are not citizens of the America, and they hence cannot sue anyone in the court, or they're not citizen. They don't have any right to consult Supreme Court. So it's a horrible case, but it was reverted later on. But keep that in mind. This case happened in 1857. So these cases were fueling the fire of this Civil War. And this Uncle Tom's Cabin, this book came in 1852. This case where, people in the North and in much of America, people wanted the slavery to end. But in the middle of that, this case came up where the Supreme Court is saying that, we don't think African Americans are citizens, right? But that's just one case. And the second case, I think the important case which is related to African American is Brown versus Board of Education. This case, of course, happened much later. It's in 1954. This was a positive verdict. The background is that in 1896, there was a Plessy versus Ferguson case where Supreme Court has held that, African Americans should have separate but equal education system and facilities, public spaces, separate classrooms, separate schools, separate, car and in a train, and so on and so forth. And this Brown versus Board of Education reverted that Plessy versus Ferguson case after about 60 years. It said that, separate facilities are inherently unequal. They said, for an education to be really equal, it has to be it has to be combined. In the same school, African Americans and whites should go. So that's a case which opened up intermingling of whites and blacks. So you see, on one hand, in 1850, so this is a full 1 century after the 1865, the banning of slavery. Full 1 century after that, they allow the African Americans to go to the white schools and vice versa. The intermingling of. So this one should keep this in mind. This is a picture which became viral. It became a it's a picture you will see in many books. It's a picture taken in 1863. It's a picture taken in the police station of a slave whose back is severely beaten by whipping by their slave owner. So the picture symbolizes the horrible punishments that African Americans used to go through as late as 1863. Imagine what was happening a century or 2 centuries before, right? So you would see this picture in many books and literature. So keep that in mind. When we study slavery, we should, keep those images in mind and understand the context and depth of human rights violations and all that. There's a underground railroad. It's not an actual railroad or an underground railroad. It's the name of a passage, or what would happen is that in the North, as we talked about, that there were a lot of anti-slavery anti-slavery activists who wanted the slavery to end, and they had created so many anti-slavery societies, anti-slavery society, abolitionist, so on and so forth. So there was like the people in North and South who were sympathetic to the end of slavery, sympathetic to slaves. What they were doing is they were helping as many slaves as possible run out of slavery. So this was a network of people, white and black together, who would go to South, help slaves to break free from slavery. They will give them money, or they will take them along to and get them out of South, and then give them shelter, money, and take them to the North and help them get employment and start a life as a free people. So this railroad actually had sort of the sanctuaries were called stations, and the people who were taking them, sort of the volunteers, they were called wagons. Sort of they had its own nomenclature and all that. Then there are a few things that I want to quickly go through. After we've not gone through Civil War or end of this, after Civil War, what happened? This sort of much of the this presentation is talking about till Civil War. We haven't even touched the half period after that, because I think there wasn't enough time. We'll probably touch it and we'll have a follow-up session, but I'll just quickly go through. And after Civil War, Reconstruction is the word that is used to sort of reconstruct South, sort of get them back on their feet after end of Civil War and the destruction, and after slavery, after these 4 million or so slaves were freed, getting them integrated into the society, getting them find jobs and all that. Slavery was primarily in the beginning was substituted by with the sharecropping, and then Jim Crow is sort of a set of laws in decades after end of Civil War. Jim Crow was a sort of a is as a name given to the segregation of blacks and whites. We just talked about Brown versus Board of Education case. So Jim Crow is actually even after slavery was banned and slaves were free. It talks about their segregation and the horrible second class citizen status of second class citizenship that many of the African Americans continued to face. Deep into civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and so many other people. So civil rights movement, Martin Luther King gave a very famous speech. I have a dream that one day African Americans will just intermingle will be as much of a citizens of United States as other people are. And then even until recently, in 2020, 21, we saw Black Lives Matter and the violence. This violence, next time you see Black Lives Matters and all that, remember these images and these brutality that has happened in the history. You should understand there are, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of sort of anger that goes into the African American history of slavery, and just remember those sort of things, and remember those images when you talk about slavery and how they were transported, and so just this is the context of slavery, the way I see it, sort of and before I open the stage for questions and answers, which I would happy to answer as many questions as possible. So thank you for attending this seminar. So one thing I would say is that this is my my take or my sort of journey of understanding what the slavery was about, and I took my bits and pieces from many books and online sources and tried to sort of rely on authentic sources and at the same time build. Try to find answers to all these questions. So please, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. So now, thank you very much for bearing with me. So now I think I will open the floor for questions, and I hope this seminar was of little help to you. So now please let the questions start, but please, as a priority, please focus your questions on slavery and history of African Americans, and sort of stay on the topic as a priority. You can raise your hand, and the team will open your mic and you can start questions.
Sir, Assalamu alaikum, first of all. I'm
Welcome.
Sir Malik Murad, sir. The session is wonderful, and there are the analytical approach towards history. So there is a question that I want to ask is that, sir, there is a north and south sectional division between the American history, and we see it in the past, and we also see it in the present in the map. So they have the North America. Behind the North America, they have the Mexico. So, sir, what kind of these peripheries and global south, global north division, and they breed the poverty, which threat the prosperity ultimately? So, sir, kindly just tell your take on this stance.
Well, I think what is essentially has happened in the history is that the empires or people have exploited other people for centuries, and then at the end they try to become they try to show as if they are very civilized, and try to just just by simple apology of a few words, or sort of or by opening immigration to those people, they think they've sort of hidden their past. Sort of the British Empire and American Empire, these empires were causing these sort of horrible conditions. They were treating these African Americans horribly. And this session should explain as well that how the African continent was exploited for centuries for slave labor. Imagine imagine that in Pakistan, just imagine for a moment, there is a whole industry. People could kidnap you from your houses, from your agricultural fields, from anywhere. The slave catchers will catch you, put bandages, put on your mouth, tie you, and take you as a piece of good, just like you are a commodity, and take you and sell you to the to someone on the shore, and then ships would put you, or rather throw you in ships and take you to an alien land. You are not familiar with the language, the culture, or anything, and you reach there, you are sold in the market there, and immediately you are whipped, you are beaten, you are separated from your family, and you have to do backbreaking work for 15-20 hours every day for very little food and shelter. Imagine that has happened for centuries in Africa and other parts of the country. Right now, the topic is about Africa. It concerns Africa, but similar things has happened in similar kind of exploitations has happened in subcontinent as well. I am not sort of a person. I'm not a kind of person who's sort of I'm not an emotional sort of kind of person who would sort of get swayed by emotions. But I think we should keep those things in mind. If Africa is an impoverished, war-ridden continent, which it had been for a long period of time, which now I believe is getting out. Africa is progressing really well lately, but much of that poverty, you can see the roots of that poverty after this session. You can decide yourself. I don't need to tell you what happened. If while America was building itself, British were building themselves, other civilizations were building themselves. In Africa, people were being kidnapped and transported to other countries to become slaves and become their labor. These slaves were producing their tobacco, cotton, and enriching these people. And the merchants would take those slaves and first make profit out of the selling that slave trade, and then slaves labor was free of cost labor, and then these labor and the commodities were sold around the world, and British Empire, American Empire was becoming rich. Where do you think the wealth of Europe and the British and the US come from? Where did it came from? From the labor of these exploited people. And then this was not enough. On top of that, they had to go through whipping, the sexual violence, I don't like to use that R word, but sexual violence and all kind. It's the worst kind of tragedy in human history. So
Sir, it
this is
means we can say that there is no difference between the mercantilism and the capitalism, because in both ideologies, we exploit the resources of other countries, other states, without dishonoring them.
Well, I think there's slavery. Capitalism is different in a sense where you voluntarily provide your labor. It is not by force. It has its own different modus operandi. But I think capitalism is, you cannot compare this involuntary forced forced slavery to voluntary participation in labor force that nowadays we do.
Got
I
it, sir.
don't think
Got it.
you
Got
can't
it. Because
compare
in
these two things.
capitalism, there is a voluntary things we do,
Yeah, yeah.
but in mercantilism, there are not voluntary things. Sir, got it.
No,
Thank you, sir.
mercantilism is a philosophy of maximizing your foreign exchange. It's a philosophy which is relevant today as well. It was like a sort of a craze that you have to, Europeans, they were, because larger ships were possible, and people were the joint stock companies and merchants, they were financing. Let me just tell you just quickly what happened. In Europe, in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages, obviously in the Europe's Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, Muslims were the primary, sort of superpower. And then during the Crusades, the Christians, they came into, they were fighting with Muslims, and during fighting with Muslims in Spain and in I think in Northern Africa, they came to realize they found out all these books and knowledge during those interactions, and that is where American sort of and then also the Italian merchants, Italy became city ports, like of Sicily and Florence and all that, Venice. The merchants of those cities, they became very wealthy, and they started to work as bankers. And these bankers would finance. That is why the Christopher Columbus was actually Italian. He was Italian, financed by Portuguese. So they accumulated a lot of wealth, and then they started investing that wealth into financing exploration of the world. These large adventurers would go around the world, and the idea was to become rich as possible by controlling the wealth of the world. And then they discovered tobacco and due to technological advances, the cotton, and then the first industrial revolution, cotton was converted into. So these countries had a monopoly
Colombo was sir, Italian. That's why he has some kind of traits of Sicilian mafia when he arrived at the shores of
obviously
at the Inca Maya civilization.
Right. Yeah. If you read that People's History of United States by I'm forgetting the author's name. It's very like People's History. So obviously Howard Zinn. Yeah. So you would realize that definitely this is like much of history. This is what was the practice. Nobody sort of it's very interesting that in Canada, they were not big on slavery, but they were big on sort of killing Native Americans. Obviously, America was big on sort of, they were killing Native Americans and as well as enslaving African Americans as well. And So the empire, these empires, one needs to understand without resorting to sensationalism, or sort of having one-sided analysis. One should understand the roots of those things. But at the same time, if you read U.S. history, you would not help yourself but be sort of amazed by the amazing progress they've done, this constitutional development. If the slavery started in the US, the anti-slavery movements also started in the US. So there was good and bad, both was there, and these forces were fighting. And in the Civil War, and then North became triumphant. So American history, there's a lot of good technological advancement. There was a lot of they became the superpower because of the reason they were one of the best in whatever they were doing.
Sir, gig democracy provide a very much intrinsic role in the development of this nation.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I mean, without democracy, I don't think America would have been this big of a empire. I mean, I think I'm of the opinion that democracy is probably one of the is the best form of government a human being have come up with. I think democracy the kind of democracy where you have the freedom of speech, property rights, where the contracts are binding, where there is a rule of law. That kind of democracy and open exchange of ideas has enormous benefits. And America is enjoying the fruits of the democracy even till this day. Anybody goes to America, they become a free citizens. In our own country, in Pakistan, we cannot say so many things. In America, you can say anything. The Constitution protects you. You can go there and start shouting about Joe Biden or whatever, their generals and all that. Nobody will touch you because you're protected by the Second Amendment. You're protected by so there's a lot of benefits of, America has attracted talent throughout its history. It was a population of 5 million people at the time of independence. And now it's like more than 320 million. So most of the growth has come from immigration, So I'll take question from Sakiba. जी अपना थोड़ा सा बताएं Sakiba, where are you from?
Hi. Yeah. Assalamualaikum. Sorry, it's actually Eliza. I'm using my cousin's phone to log in.
Right.
So my name is Eliza, and I've been looking to join your session for the preparation of the special exam.
Okay. Where are you from? Like, how long have you been preparing for CSS, and why did you choose this subject, or are you choosing this subject? Are you still thinking? Just talk about that as well.
I'm basically from Islamabad, and this will be my first attempt. I've been looking to prepare for CSS for the past few months now. I haven't started studying US history as a subject yet, but I heard this was the most scoring subject and it's very easy to cover. But now that I've talked to a lot of people, I've heard it's not as easy as scoring, and it looks shorter, but it's not as easy to cover as people think. And so I started to go around the books, and I realized it is very interesting, but it's not very easy to understand because as short as it is, it includes a lot of details and a lot of involvement with a lot of, like, when you talk about the subcontinent, you have been studying that, since you were like a little kid, how it began and how what people were involved. But when it comes to US history, most of us are very foreign to what happened there and how it began. So I understood all that part when it came from British colonialism, but right after that, the amount of people who started entering the US and the evolvement of US that happened within that particular 100-year is creating a lot of confusion for me. So I was looking to take some help, and I saw this app online, so I decided to join your course.
Right. So what's your question? I will respond to your I will respond to that as well, but let's first hear your question. Yeah.
My question was, is slavery in general rooted from colonialism? Because capitalism is something I do not connect with slavery as much as how slavery developed.
I think, I'll first answer your question and then I'll comment on a few things you said earlier. I think it's I think slavery is I think it's about the evolution of human mind. I think the human conscious. If you pay attention to evolution of ideas, this democracy that we talk about or capitalism that we talk about. Particularly, let's talk about democracy and liberalism. These ideas came out of French Revolution and sort of around French Revolution, a little after Renaissance in Europe. So these ideas came out from somewhere. Obviously Greeks had their democracy and all that, but much of the words like liberty, freedom, no taxation without representation, representative, these ideas were a work of enlightenment of scholars like John Locke and Montesquieu. My pronunciation sometimes is very wrong, so don't help me. But the point is, so I think human evolution, I think now with the clarity that we all sitting in this seminar, the kind of clarity we have that slavery is bad and the slavery is violation of human rights. I think people back in those days didn't have that kind of clarity. The human mind had not evolved as much. I think even though I was having this discussion with other people that even though in Islam in the 6th century Islam talked about trying to say that freeing your slave is a good deed. The Prophet said that. And Hazrat Bilal, who was a slave and African American, I think who was a former slave, and he was a African American, African descent as well. He was very dear to Prophet Muhammad. He was a dear Sahaba, and he used to give azan. And they were in our Islamic history. We have those things. It's good to be generous, and you don't need to beat and all that. And we had that kind of bits in Islamic history. But I think I think human beings are capable of doing those things, and they and the economic benefits and the frenzy of that time. I think America, the slavery we study, I think slavery primarily in the modern world is related to North America. I am not, in Europe, there was serfdom and all that, but it was abolished much earlier. Even, America was probably, the US was the last to, to ban slavery. So I think in America, there was a mix of, you are people from Europe, people who were either running away from religious persecution, they came to America, or people who were impoverished, or they lost their land. They were coming to America to make it big here. And they were faced with the challenges of, there was Native Americans, tribes living here. They had to clean them. They had to kill them or sort of corner them to find a home here or to expand. And at the same time, the slavery was available. These people were not doing the slavery. Slavery was already happening. So slaves were available readily. Indentured servants and slavery, it was available. They took advantage of it. I think in my mind, I think human beings are capable of doing the worst kind of things. And they've done it in all times. Even even we are not better this time. Even in in Arab countries, the conditions of labor, if you study that, it's horrible as well. I think the Arab sort of this human consciousness is developing there. I think it will ultimately the consciousness will evolve there as well. It will take its own evolution. But I think democracy was, the white people were benefiting from democracy. And they were, some people genuinely believed that these African Americans, due to propaganda or whatever, that these African Americans, they are not equal to us. Their brain is not smart enough. They're not capable of, they're not
Fixed
capable of good.
mindset.
Yeah, that was the mindset. So it happened in that kind of environment. We need to understand. But the fact is, it happened, and the way it happened, and the way it was sort of abolished. That is an interesting history. And you know what? Even like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, when I started studying slavery, I was actually shocked that beings have done these things in the past. It was something that I could not believe. I mean, it was unbelievable for me until I read the different stories from ex-slaves, from the pictures, or I showed a picture of 1850. Camera was invented back then, and this, like it is a horrible thing that had happened, and you would reading at some of the history of subcontinent, you would see some kind of horrible things here as well, but nothing as compared to the horrors of slavery that has gone there. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. So basically, it's all rooted in the tyrannous nature of man. Like even like
I
before
think,
slavery, if you think like even if you consider your own Islamic history, there have been a lot of incidents like the Waqia of Karbala, and then you know a lot of similar incidents where people have been nothing but violent with other men just because they feel they're superior to the others. So I think this was
yeah,
a
yeah,
similar thing already present
yeah.
in the society
Yeah,
when you
and after slavery, trace the evolution of human woman rights. The feminism, or the women were allowed to vote in 1920 in America. I mean, the universal woman suffrage happened at in 1920. So again, America was probably one of the last in terms of women voting as well. So this sort of, I think. The human beings, we were animals, so we evolved from animals, and then the consciousness developed over time. And I think the printing press and mass dissemination had to happen before evolution. I think we're still going through different kinds of evolutions. Different sectors of society still don't have as much rights in different parts of the world, so it's an evolution that we are going through, and will continue to go through, I think.
okay, so I guess that
Yeah, yeah,
wraps up my
just
whole
yeah,
question. But
yeah, 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 yeah. I had to comment on what you said. In the last webinar that I had, we talked about how difficult this subject is, especially after the very difficult exam that came in 2023 in February. It was a very, very difficult exam. So much so, even I would have failed that exam. I can tell you, I'm not exaggerating. And then exam came out. I did not know what was the middle passage. I had to look up. Even I did not know what was the Northwest Passage. Right? I could answer two questions maybe. And you can go through that exam in the app. So that exam has scared a lot of people. We have talked about this in the last webinar as well, that this is a very, very difficult subject. The US history. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's for the people who are analytically and mentally strong, and who can go through difficult and nuanced coursework, and then hope that the examiner would be generous. But having said that, I would add, after that webinar, I had a couple of weeks of further thinking, and I think although that is true, but I would say one thing. Although it is a difficult subject, but if you prepare it, it helps you a lot in other subjects in the CSS exam, and also in life. It is a subject worth knowing. It has a lot of benefits if you know US history. Why is that? Because you like it or not, US is the superpower. It is in everywhere. If you hopefully, if you become CSS officers and you go to foreign service and all that, you will be dealing with United Nations, United States, and other kinds of, everywhere. It helps to understand US history, and through US history, because US was the superpower for a good part of last couple of centuries. Through US history, you understand the important world events: World War I, World War II, League of Nations, United Nations, IMF, Bretton Woods, and a lot of other war on terror, all these topics which are fundamental to other subjects in the CSS, for example, Pakistan affairs, current affairs. These knowledge can be very helpful in essay, sometimes comes from that. And in other subjects, the US, if you take constitutional law, or, the US, if you study US history, it helps you in many US subjects and generally in your life. So it's a subject in that context. I think it's worth giving it a try. And it would reward those bold people who take that decision to prepare it properly. I think to prepare this subject properly, you would need at least a year, or about a year to an average or above average mind. And you have to stop kidding yourself by just, looking at a few videos and reading a few books. Reading and watching videos is not equal to you being able to reproduce your material in the exam. So you have to do the practice of writing the exams, do mock exams, or do talks like this. I will have to tell you that a week ago or 2 weeks ago, I did not know as much about slavery as I do. Be able to, so either you are able to teach those topics or write those topics. So prepare that for a year, including that, and include a lot of mock exams and writings, because and so if you do that, go through all that hassle, I think it could be well worth it for a lot of people. Can we have other questions, Malik? I know you have a lot of questions, and you have my number. We talk offline as well. I would just give other people.
Sir, I have a last question, sir. I have a last question. It has two parts, sir, please.
Yeah.
Sir, part number one is, sir, what should be a standard length of writing answer? And sir, अगर slaughter हो जाता है, for suppose जैसे 2000, तो एस्पायरेंट्स ऐसे कौन से स्टेप्स ले सकता है अपनी राइटिंग कैपेबिलिटीज के बुनियाद पर कि वो एटलीस्ट एग्जामिनर को सेटिस्फाई कर सके या उसको परसुएट कर सके एंड कन्वे कर सके? That's it.
Okay. Remember one thing that goes in your favor is that the scoring and CSS exam is all relative. Relative in the sense they are going to select the best 300 or 400 candidates, no matter how difficult the exam is. Even the most difficult of the exams, the most worst kind of slaughters, the examiner still has to choose the best 300 or something like that, right? So if the exam is very, very difficult, examiner knows that, and he has to pass a few students at least, right? So don't give up, just write as much as you know. Even write, if you know anything circumstantially, just write it, rather than, giving up, just write anything relevant. So I would say just, if you know things around that subject, the best approach is obviously, the best is to stick to the subject and be as precise or relevant. That is the way to get the maximum marks. But if you don't know the core of a question, then write anything around it. If you think what era it's talking about. For example, if there's a question is about Harry Truman, and you know nothing about Harry Truman, think about when did Harry Truman became president. I think it became president after FDR, Frederick Roosevelt. And imagine what was happening there. After Roosevelt presidency ended when the World War had just ended. World War II had just ended. So you can think in Harry Truman, probably reconstruction of Europe and Japan was happening, sort of Marshall Plan, and talk about those things. So you don't give up, just try to make up few things. And examiner, I think, can be a little forgiving. They understand that not everyone can know everything. So try to sort of, guess what could be going on. If they ask you, write a note about what happened after US evacuation from Afghanistan and Taliban's takeover. Even if you haven't prepared for the exam, just write whatever you have heard from the newspaper and try to, sort of mention those things. And, even if they're talking about, let's say, what's the procedure of selecting a US president? This is a question that came in when I gave CSS exam in 2017. And I had just, watched in the news what happens. They have the primaries, they have the debates, they have electoral college and all that. Just even if without knowing, we know something about US, and that's a good thing and a bad thing as well. Good thing because you can say something, and bad thing because it gives a lot of people false impression that they know US history and they can ace it, while that's not true. So it's a double-edged sword as well. I would really like to get in more questions from other people. So guys, anybody who has questions, please ask questions. Just if you don't have questions, which I'd prefer to have a few more questions, just let me know, how was this webinar? Has it benefited you? And in what ways, what parts were useful, what parts were not useful? How can I make my next webinar better than this? And just give me some feedback. I think in the chat, we have a few questions. Okay. Malik, Zahir Khan, wonderful session, sir. Fatma, Zafar, thanks for good session. Malik, preacher liver. So I would, right, Elisa, yeah.
I do have a question. It's not related to the topic that we currently did, just in general.
Right.
If I would join this session, I just wanted to know all the notes and the presentations that you shared here currently. Will you be providing us with those?
Right. Yes, I will. What I will do is we will put those things in the app. There will be a link in the app where you can click and go through Google Drive. So essentially, the nutshell, these things will be available in the app by start of next week. And secondly, I'm teaching this course. The course starts. It's an 8-week course on the US history. The course starts on 23rd of May. In about 10 days, the course is starting from Tuesday, 23rd of May. So do check that course outline. If you think that course will help you, you can take that course. We are also adding a few more courses in the app. So watch out for those as well. So that's this material is will be freely available.
Okay. Just one more thing. You asked for feedback.
Right.
I agree. The session, the information was very useful and productive. But I would really suggest if we could ignore this language barrier thing, because there are a lot of certain things that like our native language is Urdu.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I can. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Our last webinar was in Urdu. I just started off in just the language. I don't know. But we can do that. We can do that in Urdu as well. That's not an issue. But yeah, there are two things I would say on that. One is that knowledge is knowledge, regardless of in which language it is, Punjabi, Urdu, whatever. Knowledge is knowledge. You need to know things, right? You need to be able to logically present things. And secondly, although I do Urdu में भी मैं करता हूँ webinar and कर सकता हूँ and कर सकते हैं, but I think it sometimes helps to sort of speak in English or write in English so that it sort of prepares you, gets you in the flow, because exam is going to happen in English, right? So it's a bit of both, I would say. So in that sense, I am a multilingual. Urdu can work as well. And maybe the next seminar would be in Urdu. Yeah.
I am so sorry. I didn't mean suggesting that your entire session should be in Urdu. Just saying, like, at places where Urdu is more convenient. I think
Yeah. That would help. Yeah, I know. That's true. Because so at the end of the day, English is not my first language. So sometimes so yeah, I mean, that's a good suggestion. But sometimes, when I am in flow, it's very difficult to switch to Urdu. जी कोई और सवाल? जी, language is not language तो कोई barrier नहीं है. I think anybody please. If there are no more questions, we can close this. I think the session is being recorded and it should be available on YouTube as well, and by the middle of next week. I thank you very much, and I would just say one thing at the end, that I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert. There would be mistakes in my presentation and delivery. And I apologize for that. If you point out any mistakes, I would be happy to accept those and correct them. So keep that in mind. I'm not an authority. You should use your own judgment and your own R&D, your own thing. Feel free to consult as many sources as possible. And do let me know about your feedback. You have in our app, you have a WhatsApp number. Drop your feedback there. If you want to talk to me, you should be able to find my WhatsApp number from our contact number. You have my email address, amir.siddique@apris.io. If you want to be to be included in our newsletter on US history, let us know as well. No, it's US history. अगर मैंने European history का है, तो I think that could be a slip of my tongue. It's US history. Fatma, there's a question. So thank you very much. European history, I am interested in that as well. Maybe after a few months, I'll have to prepare that course as well. I might, offer webinars. History is a very dear subject to me. It's it's all I read mostly nowadays. So, but that's in the future. For now, we'll focus on the US history. So thank you very much for attending this webinar on short notice and bearing with us for the technical difficulties, and apologies for joining this session late. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you, sir.